The room was already on its feet when she walked in. She didn't understand why. She looked behind her, a reflex, the instinct of someone who has spent a lifetime assuming that whatever is happening in a room is happening for someone else. The applause was enormous, and it was aimed directly at her, and she took a step backward, which is the most important thing to understand about who she is. She took a step backward. A hand closed around her arm. A voice said, "This is for you." She shook her head. She was still shaking her head when they guided her forward into the loudest moment of her life. But this story doesn't start there. It starts the way she always started, before the sun came up, before the voices, before the building became the thing it needed to be for everyone else. It starts in the dark, with a mop, and a woman who had been arriving at 5:43 every morning for 40 years. Her name was Mrs. Grace. She was a janitor, and she had no idea that today, her last day, was going to end the way it did. If a story like this stops you, hit subscribe. We tell the kind of stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. And drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The school was at its most honest before anyone arrived. No voices, no bells, no performance of learning or authority or routine. Just a building in the dark. Cold floors, locked classrooms, the particular silence of a place that exists only in relation to people who are not yet there. Mrs. Grace had always loved it at this hour. She arrived at 5:43, the same as she had for the better part of 4 decades. Not 5:40 or 5:45, 5:43. Because that was the time it took to walk from the bus stop on Clement Road at a pace that didn't rush and didn't drag. She had never owned a car, she had never needed one. The walk was hers, and the dark was hers, and the 22 steps from the side entrance to the supply closet were hers in a way that no part of the building ever was once the children arrived. She hung her coat on the 3rd hook, not the 1st, not the 2nd, the 3rd. Some habits don't start as habits. They start as decisions made once for no particular reason that slowly become the architecture of a life. She filled her mop bucket in the utility sink and listened to the water run. The fluorescent light above her buzzed at a frequency she had long since stopped hearing. The smell of the cleaning solution, industrial lemon, slightly chemical, nothing like an actual lemon, was as familiar to her as the smell of her own home. More familiar some mornings. She started with the main hallway, as she always did. The mop moved in long, unhurried arcs. She worked without music, without a radio, without the earbuds the younger custodial staff wore. She had tried them once, years ago, and found she didn't like being cut off from the building. She preferred to hear it. The particular creak of the 3rd classroom door, the way the heating system knocked twice before it caught, the sound the east corridor made when the temperature outside dropped below a certain point. She knew this building the way you know a person you have lived alongside for a long time. Not perfectly, not without mystery, but with the kind of knowledge that doesn't need to announce itself. By 6:30, the main hallway was done. By 7, the girls' bathrooms on the ground floor and the staff room. She moved without urgency and without waste, the motion of someone who has made peace with the work, who stopped performing efficiency long ago and simply became it. At 7:22, she sat on the bench outside the gymnasium and ate half a sandwich she had made the night before, egg and tomato on brown bread, wrapped in foil the way her mother had wrapped things. She chewed slowly and looked at the row of student drawings taped to the wall opposite. Crayon trees, lopsided suns, a house that might have been a school, drawn by a child who perhaps saw no difference between the two. Retirement was 4 days away. She had not told many people, The vice principal knew, of course, and the office staff, and a few of the teachers she had worked alongside long enough to exchange more than a nod. But she had not made an occasion of it. It was not the kind of thing she made occasions of. She expected, when the day came, a handshake from the principal. A card, perhaps, one of those generic ones with a sunset on the front, signed by people who would draw a small smiley face next to their names because they couldn't think of anything else to write. That was fine. That was enough. She finished her sandwich, wrapped the foil neatly, and stood. There was still the east corridor to do. The snacks lived in the bottom drawer of the supply closet, behind the spare mop heads. A box of crackers, some individually wrapped biscuits, a few small cartons of juice that she bought on Thursdays from the corner shop on her way home, because Thursday was when they marked them down. Nothing elaborate, nothing that required explanation, just enough for the children who arrived at school with that particular look, not hungry exactly, or not only hungry, but diminished in some way that had happened before they even walked through the door. She never made a fuss about it. She didn't call their names or wave them over. She simply noticed, the way she noticed everything in that building, and when the moment was quiet enough, she would appear beside them with something in her hand and an expression that said, "This is nothing. This is just a thing that is happening. You don't need to feel anything about it." Most of them took it without a word. Some said thank you. A few never looked at her at all, which she understood. Shame is a private room, and you don't always want a witness standing at the door. She knew about the bullying long before any teacher did. She couldn't have explained how precisely. Something in the way a child moved through a corridor, too close to the wall, too aware of who was behind them. Laugh pitched slightly wrong, the kind of laugh that is really a form of disappearing. She had seen it so many times that she recognized it the way you recognize weather. You don't need a forecast, you can feel it in the air. She never confronted the children who were doing it. She had learned over the years that confrontation moved the problem rather than solved it. Instead, she arranged herself. She was present in the corridors where it was happening. She found small reasons to be nearby. Her presence alone, unhurried, unalarmed, simply there, was often enough to change the temperature of a moment. For the ones who cried in hallways, she sat down. Not always beside them, sometimes a few feet away, her back against the wall, going about some small piece of work that required no urgency, giving them the company without the pressure of it. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. She never pushed. She had learned that some pain needs a witness more than it needs a response, and that the most useful thing you can offer a person who is falling apart is simply the evidence that the world has not stopped moving. She stayed late for this, unpaid, unasked, unrecorded. She never mentioned it to anyone, not to the teachers, not to the principal, not to the other custodial staff. It had not occurred to her that it was mentionable. The floors needed cleaning, and the children needed steadying, and both of these things were, as far as she was concerned, the work. She simply did the work. All of it. Diane almost scrolled past it. She had been on her phone during a break between shifts, half present the way you are at the end of a long night, not looking for anything in particular. The alumni group for her old school was not somewhere she visited often. Mostly it was lost cats and local election arguments and the occasional post from someone trying to sell a secondhand sofa. But the notification had come up and she had tapped it without thinking, and then she had stopped. Mrs. Grace is retiring after 40 years. If she ever helped you, now's the time to say so. The post had been written by a current parent, a woman named Sandra, whose son was in the 5th grade and who had heard the news from his teacher. It was not eloquent. It was not designed to go anywhere. It was just a simple sentence from someone who thought it was a shame that a woman like that should leave without anyone saying something. Diane set her phone down. She picked it up again. She thought about a Tuesday morning in November, many years ago, when she was 13 years old and sitting on the floor of the East Corridor with her knees pulled to her chest and no intention of going to class or explaining why. She had not spoken to anyone about what was happening at home. She had not known how. She remembered the sound of a mop bucket being wheeled to a stop nearby, and then nothing. No questions, no instructions, just the quiet presence of a woman who sat against the opposite wall and asked for nothing. She had gone to class that day. She was not sure she would have otherwise. Diane typed her comment, 3 sentences. She was a registered nurse now, she said, working long shifts in a city 4 hours from where she grew up, and she had thought about that Tuesday morning more than once when the work was hard, and she needed to remember why she had chosen it. She posted it and put her phone away and went back to work. By the time her next break came, there were 47 replies beneath hers. Mark had written about a bag of crackers pressed into his hand without ceremony when he was 9 years old, on a morning he would prefer not to describe in detail. A retired teacher named Mr. Osai had written about watching Mrs. Grace talk a trembling child through a panic attack in the corridor outside his classroom, calm and unhurried, as if she had nowhere else to be and nothing else to do. A woman wrote on behalf of her daughter, who was now a social worker, and said the story was too long for a comment box and she didn't know where to begin. The post spread into a neighboring community group, then another, then 2 more. By the end of the second day, it had been shared across 4 separate groups, covering 3 different parts of the city. The comments climbed past 300. The school's vice principal, a man named Mr. Thomas, saw it on the morning of the 3rd day. He read it at his desk for a long time. Then he picked up the phone. A plan took shape quickly, not because anyone was organized, but because no one needed to be. She arrived at 5:43. Of course she did. The bus stop on Clement Road, the walk that didn't rush and didn't drag, the side entrance, the 3rd hook. She moved through the opening of her last morning the same way she had moved through every other morning, without ceremony, without the kind of self-consciousness that turns ordinary actions into occasions. She had decided, some weeks ago, that she would not treat today differently. It would not help anyone, least of all herself, to make a performance of ending. She filled the mop bucket. The fluorescent light buzzed. The cleaning solution smelled of industrial lemon. She started with the main hallway. It was quieter than usual, but she didn't think much of it at first. End of term carried its own atmosphere. Teachers behind closed doors finishing paperwork, staff moving with the slightly distracted energy of people mentally already somewhere else. She had seen it every year for 4 decades. She recognized it the way she recognized all the building's moods. What she did not recognize, and did not think to question, was that several of the closed doors had people standing very still just behind them. She mopped. She worked her way through the ground-floor bathrooms. She wiped down the staff room surfaces and straightened the chairs that were always left at angles, because the chairs in that room had always been left at angles, and someone had always needed to straighten them, and for 40 years that someone had been her. Mrs. Rose passed her in the corridor at 7:30. She said good morning. She did not meet her eyes for quite as long as she usually did, and she turned toward her office a fraction sooner than was natural, but Mrs. Grace noted neither of these things. She said good morning back, and kept moving. She was in the hallway outside the 3rd grade classroom when she stopped. She was not sure why. There was nothing particular about the moment, no sound, no interruption. Nothing to mark it as different from the 10,000 mornings that had come before it. But she stopped, and she stood, and she looked down the length of that corridor in the early light, and something moved through her that she could not have named. 40 years settled into her body all at once, not heavily, more the way a long breath releases, a slow, complete thing.
She thought of the hallway as it had looked when she first arrived, younger than she could quite remember being. She thought of the children, so many children. Their faces came to her not in any order, but all together, the way things come when you are not trying to hold them. She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she put it away, the way she had always put things away, neatly and without fuss, in the place inside her where she kept what was too large to carry in the open. She collected her keys from the supply closet. She checked the time. She smoothed the front of her uniform once with the flat of her hand, an old unconscious habit, and she walked toward the auditorium. A handshake, she thought, a card with a sunset on the front. That was fine. That was enough.
She pulled open the auditorium door, and the first thing she felt was warmth. The second thing she saw was people. She stopped walking. Her hand stayed on the door. She looked at the rows of faces turned toward her. Too many, far too many. People she recognized and people she didn't. Adults who had the particular look of people who had traveled some distance to be somewhere, and her first coherent thought was that she had the wrong room, that something else was happening here, something that had nothing to do with her, and she had walked into it by mistake. She stepped back. A hand closed gently around her arm. She turned to find Patricia, the school secretary, who had worked 3 doors down from the supply closet for 11 years, and who was now looking at her with an expression Mrs. Grace did not know how to receive. "This is for you, Grace," Patricia said. Mrs. Grace shook her head. She said she didn't need this. She said it quietly, and she meant it completely. Not as modesty, not as performance, but as a plain statement of fact. She was fine. A handshake was fine. There was no need for any of this. Patricia guided her forward anyway. The room rose. The applause was not the polite kind, not the brief, dutiful sound of people fulfilling an obligation. It was sustained and full and personal in a way that Mrs. Grace had no framework for, and she responded to it the only way she knew how. She kept her eyes down. She folded her hands in front of her. She made herself as small as the moment would allow, which was not very small at all, because the moment was enormous and expanding and showed no sign of stopping. Diane spoke first. She got through half a sentence before her voice broke. She rebuilt it and kept going. She spoke about a Tuesday in November and a corridor floor and a woman who had asked for nothing and given everything simply by staying. Mark spoke after her, measured, careful, a businessman's precision applied to something that had nothing to do with business. A high school teacher named Mr. Chris stood up and explained, with the particular clarity of someone who has rehearsed this and cried through every rehearsal, that he had been a frightened 14-year-old in this building once, and that certain mornings he was not sure he would have come back. A mother stood and unfolded a letter. Her son had written it, she explained, but he was working a night shift 400 miles away and couldn't be here. She read it aloud in a steady voice. The room went completely silent. Mrs. Grace held herself together through all of it. She held herself together through the applause and through Diane's broken voice, and through the letter read by a mother on behalf of a son who could not come. She had spent 40 years managing her own emotions in the presence of other people's pain, and the training held. Then a woman near the back stood up. She was slight, perhaps in her late 30s, and she said she had been a 6th grader at this school, and that she had not been an easy child to notice. She described the East Corridor. She described a specific morning, the weather, the time, the way she had been sitting with her back against the wall. She repeated word for word what Mrs. Grace had said to her. Mrs. Grace remembered the corridor. She remembered the morning. She remembered the girl, small, very still, trying to take up as little space as possible. She had never known whether it had mattered. She had never expected to find out. The moment had passed and she had moved on to the next thing, because there was always a next thing, and that was simply how it went. She had not known the girl remembered. She had not known any of them remembered. That was what broke her. Not the room, not her name spoken aloud by hundreds of people, not the scale of it. Just that. The plain, devastating fact that the moments she had released without keeping had been held, carefully, by someone else all along.
The room had grown quiet again when a woman stepped to the microphone. She introduced herself as Ruth. She said she had graduated from the school 21 years ago and that she worked now as an accountant, which she mentioned not as a credential, but as a small piece of context for what she was about to say. She spoke clearly and without hurry, in the manner of someone who has thought carefully about the weight of words and decided not to waste any. She said she was not here alone. She represented, she explained, a group of 14 former students who had found each other through the alumni post 3 weeks ago and had been working quietly ever since. Some of them were in the room, some were not. All of them had one thing in common, which was that they had received something from Mrs. Grace during their years at this school. Something small, something unannounced, and had never found an adequate way to account for it. They had decided to stop looking for an adequate way and to do something structural instead. Ruth paused. She looked down at the paper in her hands, then back up. The Grace Scholarship Fund, she said, had been established to support students at the school who faced financial hardship. It would be administered through the school in partnership with a local charitable trust, reviewed annually, and open to any student whose circumstances qualified. It was not a gesture. It was not a plaque on a wall. It was a functioning program with criteria and oversight and a board of 3, 2 of whom were sitting in this room right now. It had been seeded, she said, with an initial contribution of $47,000. She said the number plainly, without drama. A few people in the room drew breath. $47,000 raised in 3 weeks from alumni alone. No corporate sponsors, no grant applications, just people, many of them not wealthy, giving what they could in amounts that ranged from $20 to several thousand, because someone had once given them something when they had nothing, and they had been trying to find a way to pass it on ever since. The number was not round, Falake said, because it was not designed to be. It was exactly what had been given, not a target that had been hit, but a total that had accumulated freely from people who understood that freely was the only way it could be done.
The first recipient, she continued, had already been selected, a 7th grader. A girl whose family had lost their primary income earlier in the year and who had been carrying that knowledge to school every morning in the way children carry things they are not supposed to carry, quietly, heavily, alone. She would begin the next school year without that weight. She did not know yet. She would be told next week. Mrs. Grace stood at the front of the room and listened to all of this with her hands folded and her eyes very teary. She did not speak. There was nothing to say that the room had not already said better. She had arrived that morning expecting a handshake. She had spent 40 years believing that the work was its own quiet conclusion, that you did it, and it mattered for a moment, and then the moment passed and you moved on to the next corridor. What she understood now, standing in a room full of people who had carried her without her knowing, was that the moments had never passed at all. They had simply moved forward without her, finding their way into lives and choices and futures she would never fully trace. She had cleaned the floors. She had also, without ever intending to, helped build everything that walked across them. The scholarship would carry her name into classrooms she would never enter, toward children she would never meet. Her kindness would not retire. It had been made prominent, not in marble, not in ceremony, but in the most fitting form possible. in the simple, ongoing act of making sure a child had enough to keep going. There are people in our life right now doing quiet, faithful work that nobody applauds. The one who shows up before anyone else, the one who notices without being asked, the one who never makes a fuss about any of it, because to them it is simply the work. Most of them will never have a room like that. Mrs. Grace spent 40 years believing that invisible and unimportant were the same thing. They are not. They have never been. The moments you release without keeping are often the moments someone else holds for a lifetime. That is the thing this story is really about. Not the scholarship, not the standing ovation, not the hundreds of people in a school auditorium on an ordinary morning. It is about the quiet, staggering weight of showing up, consistently, thanklessly, without any expectation that it will ever be returned. It was returned. If this story stays with you, subscribe. We find the ones that don't get told enough, and we make sure they get told right. And before you go, is there someone in your life who deserves a room like that? Drop their name in the comments, or simply tell us, what would you have said to Mrs. Grace if you had been there? Silent Speaks Stories, where every story leaves a mark.